In a quiet town, two sisters disappeared at sunset on a hill where they had always played. Despite desperate searches, no footprints, no belongings, no evidence was ever found. Only silence where laughter once echoed. The hill became a place of fear, a cold case etched into memory. Yet years later, an unexpected discovery flipped the narrative, suggesting their story didn't end that evening, and the mystery was far from over. It was an ordinary late summer afternoon in the small town of Hawthorne when Emily, 12, and her younger sister Sophie, 9, were last seen on the family's hilltop property. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the grassy slopes and jagged cliffs that defined the edge of their backyard. Neighbors later recalled the girls laughing, chasing each other between clusters of wildflowers, their voices bright against the soft hum of cicadas. For a while, everything seemed normal. The sisters had always been adventurous, climbing trees, exploring the hill, and straying just far enough to feel grown up without alarm. But on that day, something felt different to those who observed them from a distance. There was a stillness to the wind, a heaviness in the light that would later be described as foreboding, though at the time, it went unnoticed. By early evening, Emily and Sophie had wandered closer to the cliff edges than usual. The terrain there was notoriously unpredictable. Loose soil, jagged rocks, and hidden gullies created hazards even for experienced hikers. Family members had warned them before about straying too far, but the girls were absorbed in their play, oblivious to danger. Around 7:15 p.m., neighbors reported hearing a sudden shriek, though none could confirm whether it came from the children or the distant forest beyond the hill. When the girls were not seen returning to the house, the first whispers of concern began to ripple through the community. Initially, their parents assumed they were nearby, exploring a familiar path, returning shortly. But as minutes turned into an hour and the sky deepened into the muted gold and orange of late sunset, worry hardened into fear. The first search was frantic yet informal. Parents, cousins, and a few neighbors fanned out across the hill, calling their names, ears straining for any response. The dense brush and steep ridges turned every step into a challenge, and soon the searchers had to rely on flashlights, the beams slicing through shadows, revealing only more rocks and undergrowth. Each call returned silence. The air grew cooler, and an unusual fog began to drift across the hilltops, curling around trees and rocks, reducing visibility to mere feet. Some locals later described seeing strange lights flicker in the mist, though investigators could never verify what had caused them. The combination of fog and failing light created an atmosphere of disorientation and dread. The initial panic was compounded by the realization that the hill was more dangerous than most in the community remembered, every shadow a potential pitfall. By the time authorities arrived, nearly 2 hours had passed. Police officers methodically canvassed the area, questioning neighbors and family, marking the last known points of the girls' movements. Their standard missing persons procedure involved a perimeter sweep, search teams, and immediate logging of potential clues. Officers noted the uneven terrain, making conventional search methods difficult, and requested tracking dogs from nearby departments. Yet, as night settled, the first sweeps yielded nothing. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no discarded belongings. The only traces left behind were the faint aroma of pine needles and wildflowers, lingering as if the girls' presence had been a ghostly imprint on the hill itself. Neighbors began to speculate, stories spreading rapidly. Some insisted they had glimpsed a shadowy figure near the ridge earlier in the day, though details were vague and inconsistent. Others described the fog as appearing suddenly, almost unnaturally, blanketing the area in a way that made even experienced searchers feel uncertain about their surroundings. Rumors of lights, moving orbs, some claimed, and one report of a low humming noise started circulating, adding layers of anxiety and speculation. While investigators attempted to maintain focus on rational leads, the community's collective imagination began to overlay the mystery with fear. Every rustle, every whisper of wind became a possible sign of what had happened to the girls. Inside the home, the parents struggled to maintain composure. Friends and relatives arrived to help, bringing flashlights, walkie-talkies, and blankets. The girls' toys were left scattered where they had been last seen, a visual echo of sudden absence. Every room held the weight of the unknown, every unanswered call to the sisters amplifying the silence. Police officers noted the emotional strain, but focused on methodical procedure, mapping the terrain, marking potential hazards, and preparing to expand the search in the morning. As night deepened, searchers felt the hill's treacherous nature firsthand. Steep inclines, hidden gullies, and uneven stone forced them to proceed slowly, carefully navigating terrain that could easily conceal evidence. Even with modern equipment, the hill seemed to swallow sound and movement, creating a disorienting effect that amplified fear. The first night concluded with no discoveries, only the lingering impression of absence. Investigators documented every detail: fog patterns, terrain anomalies, witness statements, and environmental conditions. All of it became part of the growing file on a disappearance that defied explanation. By midnight, a sense of unease had settled over the town. Police called off the active search until first light, advising families to stay in touch with officers. The small community, now awake with worry, could only wait. The hill, familiar by day, had transformed into a landscape of uncertainty, and the sisters' fate remained hidden somewhere within its folds. The sun had set without resolution, and by the first morning, the search would resume with a deeper understanding that this was no ordinary missing persons case. The lingering questions, the shrouded ridge, the sudden fog, the unexplained lights, would continue to haunt the town, setting the stage for a slow-burning investigation that would stretch over years, each lead layered with hope and dread, each sunrise revealing how little was truly known about what had happened to Emily and Sophie. By the following morning, local law enforcement had mobilized an organized search operation. Officers coordinated volunteers from surrounding towns, dividing the hill and adjacent forest into sectors. Tracking dogs, brought in from neighboring counties, sniffed cautiously along winding paths and through dense underbrush, their noses alert to any lingering trace of Emily and Sophie. Drone patrols scanned the treetops and cliffs, though the device's cameras often revealed only shadows and movement of wildlife. As the search stretched into hours, patterns began to emerge, most notably the inconsistencies in witness statements from neighbors and passers-by. Some insisted the girls had been playing near the cliffs at the last light of day, while others claimed they had vanished closer to the forest line. Each version added another layer of uncertainty, complicating the searchers' efforts to triangulate a starting point. Tension mounted when a lone camper, staying in a cabin several hundred meters from the hill, approached officers with a claim that would fuel both fear and speculation. He reported seeing two shadowy figures moving in the tree line around sunset. The man insisted the figures were small, possibly children, but their movements were oddly deliberate, almost cautious, as if they were aware of being observed. His account spread quickly through the small community and, when picked up by local media, transformed the case from a tragic missing person situation into something unexplainable. Words like mysterious disappearance and strange sightings appeared in newspaper headlines and on evening broadcasts. The sisters' faces, Emily with her bright eyes and mischievous grin, Sophie with her curls and quiet laughter, were plastered across television screens, alongside calls for any tips or sightings. Despite the growing media attention, the physical search yielded little progress. Search teams moved through the forest systematically, climbing steep inclines, scanning dense foliage, and occasionally pausing to call the girls' names. The dogs, though skilled, were frequently misled by overlapping scents, wildlife tracks, hikers' footprints from previous days, and the shifting wind patterns of the hill. Every potential clue, an overturned branch, a piece of torn fabric, or a distant movement, was investigated, but consistently ended in frustration. Hours stretched into a day with no new information, leaving volunteers exhausted, their nerves frayed by the tension of combing terrain that seemed both familiar and hostile. Psychological strain began to show among the searchers. Some admitted to imagining shapes moving in shadows or hearing faint calls that vanished when pursued. Officers rotated teams to prevent exhaustion, but the sheer scale of the operation, combined with the urgency of finding children, weighed heavily. Meanwhile, The parents stayed close to the search headquarters, receiving updates yet unable to participate directly. Their grief was visible in the way they scanned every returning volunteer, clinging to hope with each reported movement of dogs or drone cameras. Friends and relatives provided comfort, but the emotional intensity was palpable, every silence a reminder of the sisters' absence. Authorities started examining all plausible scenarios to explain the disappearance. Accidental fall was the first consideration, given the treacherous cliffs and gullies of the hill. Teams mapped every steep incline, searching for signs of a stumble, loose clothing, or broken branches. Abduction was considered next, spurred by the camper's account and the shadowy figures seen in the tree line. Officers coordinated with surrounding police departments, checking for recent reports of suspicious individuals, but no matches emerged. The possibility of foul play, while less likely in a community that prided itself on safety, could not be dismissed. Detectives questioned locals, checked past crime reports, and reviewed any potential leads, yet every line of inquiry seemed to dissolve in the absence of tangible evidence. The community, observing the search from a distance, experienced a collective unease. Local schools sent counselors to speak with students, warning them not to wander near the hill while emphasizing the seriousness of the situation. Town meetings convened at night to provide updates, though many left more questions than answers. Conversations at grocery stores, cafes, and gas stations were dominated by speculation. Some residents theorized about human predators, others focused on the idea of accidental misadventure. A few began to whisper about the hill itself, its hidden gullies and dense woods, almost as if the landscape had played a role in concealing the girls. As day turned into evening, search teams shifted focus toward the forest perimeter, attempting to expand the area covered. Officers used thermal imaging and GPS coordinates to track patterns, but the girls' trail remained frustratingly elusive. Each potential clue seemed to vanish under the weight of natural obstacles. Sudden dips in terrain, thick undergrowth, and pockets of fog that drifted unpredictably as the sun lowered. Volunteers and police alike began experiencing the subtle psychological effect of chasing something that felt just beyond reach, an almost hypnotic repetition of scanning, calling, listening, and finding nothing. Despite the setbacks, hope persisted. Small discoveries, a discarded water bottle near the edge of a path, footprints that could not be conclusively linked to the girls, provided brief surges of optimism. Officers documented everything meticulously, knowing that even minor details might prove critical later. Families, clinging to each report, experienced a roller coaster of fear and hope, unable to reconcile the apparent emptiness of the hills with the reality that 2 young lives were unaccounted for. By the end of the second day, the operation had expanded to include multiple law enforcement units, volunteer groups, and media coverage, yet the sisters remained missing. The fog over the hill had lifted slightly, but its psychological weight lingered, a reminder that the landscape itself was both a barrier and a clue. Officers prepared to continue the search at first light, aware that the combination of rugged terrain, inconsistent reports, and growing public scrutiny made this case far more complex than a standard missing persons investigation. Every new lead, every shadow, and every whispered sighting would have to be weighed against what was absent, clear, undeniable evidence of where Emily and Sophie had gone. The community slept uneasily that night, haunted by the knowledge that the search was only beginning, and the hill, seemingly ordinary by day, had transformed into an enigma that would demand years of careful investigation. The questions raised by the campers' shadowy figures, the inconsistencies in witness statements, and the vast empty forest would set the tone for the slow, relentless search that would define the weeks and months to come, each step marked by hope, exhaustion, and the ever-present fear of what might never be found. 3 days after the disappearance, the initial search grids had been meticulously retraced, and for the first time, investigators noticed subtle anomalies that had previously gone unnoticed. A team assigned to the ridge overlooking the hilltop found a set of small footprints pressed into the soft earth, distinct and careful, leading from a narrow path toward a steep incline. The impressions were unmistakably those of children, Emily and Sophie, but they ended abruptly at the edge of a rocky outcrop, as if whatever had continued beyond had left no trace. Officers photographed the prints, cast them in plaster, and mapped the trajectory, but the sudden halt defied explanation. It suggested either that the girls had been lifted, had turned back abruptly, or had stepped into terrain where no impression could survive. The question hovered. Why would two children, accustomed to the hill, stop without warning at a point they had crossed countless times before? Nearby, a searcher discovered a fragment of fabric snagged on a branch overhanging the ridge. The material was immediately identified as Emily's sweater, a familiar pattern and color unmistakable to her parents. Investigators carefully removed the piece, placing it into a sealed evidence bag, noting both its location and height above the ground. Forensic teams later observed that the thread frayed in a manner consistent with abrupt contact, as if the fabric had caught on something with force. While minor in isolation, in combination with the footprints, the fragment suggested movement through the landscape that was not entirely voluntary. Each piece of evidence intensified the sense of urgency. The girls' disappearance was no longer simply a case of wandering off. They had been somewhere, and something had intersected with their path. Officers then turned their attention to an unusual marking on a tree trunk near the ridge's edge. The carving consisted of a series of angular symbols, roughly etched into the bark. At first glance, they appeared random, but forensic experts debated their significance. Some posited that the marks could have been the result of natural wear, animal interaction, or weathering. Others argued the grooves were deliberate, a human-made pattern that might have indicated direction, warning, or even ritual. The tree itself was preserved and treated as a potential crime scene, its surrounding soil sampled for hair, fibers, and traces of chemical residues. Specialists in linguistics and symbology were consulted remotely, reviewing photographs to determine if the marks corresponded to any known language or iconography. Their findings were inconclusive, but the very presence of the carvings fueled both procedural diligence and public speculation. As news of the footprints, sweater fragment, and carved symbols reached the town, a wave of unease swept through the community. Locals, already shaken by the sisters' disappearance, whispered of cult activity, wandering predators, or ritualistic behavior in the otherwise quiet woods. Every tree, shadow, and overhang became a potential point of danger in the public imagination. Parents restricted their children's outdoor activities, while neighbors convened in living rooms and at town halls to discuss theories. Rumors, some implausible, circulated faster than official updates, adding a layer of psychological tension to the already high stakes of the investigation. In response to the growing anxiety, the police department enlisted psychologists to provide guidance to both families and the wider community. Counselors met with the girls' parents, addressing acute grief, the oscillating hope and despair, and the trauma of a case with so few concrete answers. Sessions focused on understanding collective grief and coping with uncertainty, recognizing that speculation and fear could exacerbate emotional strain. Psychologists recommended controlled exposure to information, careful monitoring of rumor cycles, and reassurance strategies aimed at preserving parental stability while maintaining investigative focus. Their presence underscored the recognition that this case was not merely a logistical challenge, but an emotional crisis with community-wide implications. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued to analyze the ridge and its surroundings. Soil samples from beneath the sweater fragment and near the footprints were examined for human DNA, pollen, and other trace evidence. Microscopic fibers were compared to the girls' clothing. Preliminary reports indicated no additional human interference beyond what had been collected at the tree. Drone footage was reviewed again, focusing on patterns of shadows and light that might indicate movement paths, but nothing definitive emerged. Each new layer of analysis reinforced the case's complexity. Physical clues existed, but they painted an incomplete and confusing picture. The investigators debated plausible scenarios, but no consensus emerged. Had the girls been lured by someone they knew? Had they stumbled upon an unknown presence in the woods and been forced to retreat? Or were the anomalies entirely natural coincidences, leaving the footprints, sweater fragment, and carvings as misleading hints rather than evidence? The lack of clear answers heightened the psychological toll on everyone involved, from detectives scanning maps and timelines to volunteers retracing paths day after day. The combination of minute anomalies and absent evidence created a void that imagination quickly filled, amplifying fear without resolution. As days passed, the ridge became a focal point for both law enforcement and public attention. Officers placed markers, logged measurements, and monitored all foot traffic, hoping to prevent contamination. Parents revisited the site under guidance, identifying locations where the girls had last been seen playing and tracing possible trajectories, yet every step returned them to the same unresolved questions. The very ground seemed to resist explanation, offering signs that led nowhere and inviting speculation that was impossible to confirm. By the end of the week, the initial discoveries, footprints, sweater fragment, and tree carvings, had transformed the narrative of the disappearance. The case was no longer a simple search for lost children. It had become a puzzle with symbols, partial trails, and an unknown variable at the heart of the mystery. Anxiety among families and investigators intensified, balancing between methodical investigation and the human tendency to imagine worst-case outcomes. Every step forward highlighted what remained missing, a haunting reminder that in the hills where Emily and Sophie had played, certainty was fleeting, and the truth lingered just beyond reach, suspended between what could be measured and what could only be feared. Within a week of the sisters' disappearance, what had been a quiet, grief-stricken town transformed into the epicenter of national attention. News vans and satellite trucks crowded the narrow streets, their antennas scraping the summer sky as reporters sought interviews with neighbors, parents, and volunteers. The story of Emily and Sophie became a national headline. Two young girls vanished from their family's hilltop property, leaving behind footprints, a torn sweater, and cryptic tree markings. Television channels replayed footage of the ridge and aerial maps of the hills, narrating theories of abduction, ritualistic behavior, or accident. Each broadcast increased pressure on local authorities, who were suddenly performing a high-stakes investigation under the scrutiny of a watching nation. The line between procedural diligence and public performance blurred as reporters pressed for updates and cameras captured every tearful gesture from family members. Tips began pouring into law enforcement, some plausible, others clearly intended to mislead. Dozens of calls reported sightings of two girls near distant towns, in buses, shopping centers, and parks. Each tip required verification, consuming hours of manpower and often sending search teams far from the hill. Some leads turned out to be nothing more than misidentified children or people acting on rumor. A private investigator, hired by an anxious family friend, presented what he claimed was a ransom note discovered near the ridge, handwritten in block letters and bearing threats. Handwriting analysts, however, quickly disproved the claim. The note was a crude forgery, inconsistent with the girls' parents' or local handwriting, and the language used suggested an individual attempting to attract attention rather than a genuine perpetrator. Yet, for a brief period, the note intensified fear and speculation, prompting officers to double-check every previously dismissed possibility. Amid the deluge of tips, families began receiving anonymous phone calls that carried an ominous undertone. Some callers whispered threats, others claimed knowledge of the girls' location, while a few remained silent for long, unsettling pauses. The calls arrived at all hours, eroding the family's already fragile sense of security. Each ring of the phone became a trigger for panic, forcing parents to answer with trembling hands and heavy hearts. Law enforcement installed call tracing equipment, but many of the lines led to dead ends, prepaid phones, or numbers outside the region. The cumulative effect was psychological. Sleep-deprived and hyper-alert, families found themselves oscillating between hope and despair, internalizing a sense of responsibility to protect or locate their children that no adult should bear alone. As the media spotlight intensified, scrutiny of police efforts mounted. Editorials criticized delayed responses, incomplete searches, and the lack of immediate leads. Social media amplified every rumor and misstep, some users claiming to have solved the case with armchair investigations. Detectives, forensic experts, and volunteers found themselves balancing methodical investigation with the demand to deliver answers to an impatient public. Every step forward was measured against the risk of misinterpretation, and every dead end magnified the perception of inaction. Investigators began to recognize that the most significant obstacle was not the terrain or missing evidence, but the distortive effect of public exposure on witness memory and reporting accuracy. Psychologists advising the families and the department warned of the cognitive hazards inherent in prolonged media attention. When rumors circulate widely, they cautioned, witnesses' recollections often become contaminated. Reports of sightings, sounds, or strange activity could be subconsciously altered by repeated exposure to sensationalized accounts. Eyewitness statements, previously considered reliable, became more uncertain, making it difficult for investigators to separate fact from imagination. Law enforcement adjusted protocols accordingly. Tips were logged and assessed for plausibility, and officers were trained to cross-reference accounts with physical evidence before initiating searches. The goal was to prevent the chaos of collective misperception from guiding the investigation astray. Despite these measures, the public frenzy did not abate. Every news cycle reignited discussions of abduction, cult activity, or criminal predation. Town residents were divided between those eager to cooperate with media attention and those who viewed the intrusion as a form of exploitation. Community meetings became tense, with some residents accusing reporters of sensationalizing tragedy for ratings, while others demanded more aggressive action. The emotional climate thickened, amplifying fear, guilt, and frustration. For the families, the media's presence was both a lifeline of attention and a weight of scrutiny, reminding them daily of the unresolved peril their children faced. The influx of false leads forced investigators to employ stricter triage protocols. Tips were categorized by credibility, proximity, and evidence potential, and teams were reassigned to follow only the most plausible avenues. Volunteers were briefed on the importance of verifying information before relaying it to authorities, while law enforcement held regular debriefings to assess progress, eliminate redundancies, and track anomalies. Even with these systems in place, frustration mounted as hours spent chasing fabricated sightings or bogus ransom notes delayed direct searches in critical areas near the ridge. By the end of the second week, the case had evolved from a local tragedy into a complex web of media exposure, public perception, and investigative labor. Dead ends outnumbered leads, yet every false tip carried the emotional weight of possibility. Families, volunteers, and officers alike wrestled with the tension between hope and hopelessness, a psychological burden intensified by national attention. Each unanswered question became a seed for rumor, each unverified claim a spark for fear, leaving the community in a state of suspended anxiety. Despite the chaos, the investigation maintained a quiet core of procedural rigor. Officers methodically documented every sighting, tip, and piece of evidence, understanding that while media noise could distort perception, it could not replace factual verification. The team recognized that truth would emerge only from patient analysis, careful observation, and sustained attention to detail, rather than the spectacle of headlines or the urgency of public demand. This discipline, while taxing, would eventually position investigators to separate genuine clues from distraction, setting the stage for the next critical breakthrough that would bring the search back into focus. By the close of the week, the family's resilience was stretched thin, the town's nerves were frayed, and the national audience remained riveted. The media storm had amplified every fear and speculation, but in the controlled silence of the police precinct, evidence was being cataloged, theories refined, and strategies recalibrated. What the public saw as confusion and dead ends was, in reality, a meticulous preparation for the moment when the case would pivot, when a credible lead would finally break through the fog of rumor, false hope, and distraction, bringing the search for Emily and Sophie back into tangible reach. Years slipped by, each one marked by the quiet persistence of searches that yielded fragments of history, but none of closure. Hikers occasionally found worn backpacks, rusted cans, or abandoned camping gear lodged between rocks and trees, relics of past visitors left to the hill's slow reclamation. Yet, Emily and Sophie remained absent, as if the hill itself had claimed them and refused to release any trace. In the small town, the sisters' disappearance evolved into more than a personal tragedy. It became part of the landscape, a story folded into the hills themselves. Parents who had once waited in sleepless despair now watched the seasons change, the ridge cloaked in snow, then flowering with spring blooms, the cliffs shifting in the relentless erosion of time. The community's memory of the girls hardened into a collective tension, a quiet anxiety that surfaced whenever someone mentioned the hill. Local folklore began to intermingle with the harsh facts of the investigation. Stories emerged of past vanishings, some decades old, where hikers, children, or even seasoned mountaineers had disappeared without a trace. The hill was whispered about in cafes and classrooms, in hushed tones that carried both fear and fascination. Some called it cursed, others suggested a pattern of natural danger hidden beneath a deceptively calm exterior. Researchers were invited to examine the terrain. Geologists noted unusual sinkholes, narrow fissures concealed beneath undergrowth, and ravines that could swallow a person whole. Cartographers mapped the area repeatedly, overlaying topography with previous reports of missing persons, searching for patterns that might explain the inexplicable. While the hills themselves were treacherous, these studies confirmed only that the land could be lethal, but not that it had to be. Investigators speculated endlessly on natural accidents. Could a child have wandered too close to an edge, fallen into a hidden crevice, and been carried away by erosion? Could subtle shifts in the soil explain why no tracks remained past the ridge? Yet, alongside these rational possibilities, certain anomalies remained unexplained. Soil disturbances appeared in areas where no weather patterns could have caused them. Broken branches were found at odd angles, inconsistent with natural forces. These subtle irregularities hinted at human interference. Though nothing concrete was ever discovered, each anomaly was catalogued, examined, and cross-referenced with earlier searches, but evidence remained elusive. Forensic teams found fragments of plant matter or traces of disturbed undergrowth, but nothing that could confirm a path or a struggle. The hill had absorbed the story, but not the answers. The townspeople's unease deepened as the hill's ominous reputation grew. Parents forbade children from wandering alone, even in familiar paths near the lower slopes. Hikers approached the trails cautiously, recounting eerie feelings of being watched or a sudden chill in areas where the sun should have warmed the air. Volunteers who participated in searches spoke of mental exhaustion and a creeping obsession, a sense that the hill itself resisted their efforts. Some reported hearing sounds carried by the wind, subtle whispers or footsteps, though others dismissed these as projection of anxiety. The combination of geography, folklore, and personal fear created a psychological terrain as treacherous as the cliffs themselves. Despite the passage of time, intermittent searches continued. Each summer, teams of volunteers, sometimes accompanied by local police or forest rangers, combed the hill. Drones scanned ravines and gullies, while thermal cameras captured heat signatures that often turned out to be wildlife. K9 units were brought in to follow faint trails, their noses brushing against decades of human and animal scent. Each search yielded relics of other explorers, empty tents, rusting camping equipment, but never a hint of Emily or Sophie. These results, while disheartening, also underscored the hill's unpredictability. It could conceal, redirect, and erase, offering clues that led nowhere. Scholars, psychologists, and law enforcement officers began to examine the broader implications of the hill's pattern of disappearances. They considered cognitive effects on those who searched repeatedly, how obsession, fatigue, and hope can distort perception. Each failed attempt left the community in a liminal space between grief and superstition. Rumors of hidden caves, secret paths, and unseen dangers became harder to distinguish from fact. Families who had once relied on concrete investigative results found themselves navigating stories and speculation as much as terrain. The hill had become a repository of fear, memory, and unanswered questions. While no definitive evidence emerged, these intermittent discoveries fueled ongoing interest. Researchers returned periodically to remap fissures and scan remote gullies with improved technology, hoping that modern imaging could uncover anomalies missed by earlier methods. Volunteers revisited the paths of the original searches, walking slowly through dense brush and along sheer cliffs, examining soil disturbances, broken twigs, and unusual hollows. Each journey reinforced both the mystery and the magnitude of what had been lost. For the families, these excursions were double-edged. They were a necessary pursuit of answers, yet each hour spent scanning the familiar landscape was a reminder that Emily and Sophie had vanished without a trace. Over time, the hill itself became central to the narrative of the girls' disappearance. The combination of difficult terrain, hidden dangers, and human uncertainty suggested a place where accidents, foul play, and natural concealment could coexist. The story of Emily and Sophie remained unresolved, suspended between rational explanation and the eerie weight of folklore. Anxiety, grief, and obsession continued to circulate within the town, a reminder that the hill was more than physical space. It was a locus of memory, speculation, and enduring fear. Each visitor, each researcher, each anxious parent contributed to a collective sense that the hill held its secrets tightly, offering glimpses of truth but withholding resolution. And so, the hill remained, unyielding and silent. Over the years, its slopes collected stories of past hikers and whispered warnings of danger. Yet, despite every search, every investigation, and every analysis of soil and rock, the fate of Emily and Sophie remained unknown. The mystery lingered, suspended in time, as the town continued to live in proximity to a landscape that had claimed two children and offered no answers. The hill held its secrets, and in that silence it kept the memory of Emily and Sophie alive, a constant reminder of both human fragility and the vast, untamed unpredictability of nature. 6 years had passed, and the hill had settled back into its habitual silence, the memory of Emily and Sophie lingering like a shadow over the town. Searches had become rare, news reports occasional, and the community had adapted to living alongside a mystery that refused resolution. But the unexpected has a way of breaking through even the thickest layers of time and memory. A hiker, cautious and deliberate, came forward after years of avoidance. He had stayed away from the hill because of rumors, stories whispered by locals of disappearances, strange sightings, and the eerie reputation that clung to the ridge like fog. It was only in retrospect, after moving closer to retirement and feeling a sense of moral obligation, that he contacted investigators with a recollection that had lingered at the edges of his mind. The memory was faint, almost a fragment, but vivid enough to warrant attention. The hiker recalled a secluded part of the forest, a grove far from the main trails where the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. He had seen two young girls there, Emily and Sophie, though he had not recognized them at the time. They had been accompanied by a man he initially assumed to be their father. There had been nothing overtly threatening about the scene. It had passed him as a fleeting impression during his hike, a brief encounter that left him uneasy but unconvinced anything sinister was occurring. Over the years, the recollection had gnawed at him, resurfacing in dreams, in moments of quiet reflection, until he finally shared it with authorities. Investigators approached the tip with caution. 6 years could alter the landscape, erasing trails and obscuring evidence. Yet, armed with modern technology, they revisited the site using GIS mapping and trail reconstruction, overlaying historical data with current topography. Satellite imagery allowed them to identify subtle depressions and alignments in the terrain that were invisible to the naked eye. What had been a vague recollection now guided methodical exploration. Every tree, every undergrowth, and every slope was examined for inconsistencies. It was painstaking work, slow and deliberate, requiring patience and an understanding that the hill had its own memory, a way of hiding, concealing, and redirecting those who sought its secrets. Hidden markers soon emerged in the least expected places. Old camping gear appeared wedged between roots, faded and weathered but intact. Footprints, eroded but detectable to trained eyes, suggested temporary habitation, in areas long considered undisturbed. Branches had been broken in patterns inconsistent with natural causes, as if someone had attempted to carve out a small space within the forest. Investigators documented every anomaly, cross-referencing it with historical records of searches and reports from volunteers. Forensic teams collected samples, carefully packaging fragments of cloth, dirt, and debris. DNA analysis, painstaking and slow, revealed traces on several weathered objects, confirming that Emily and Sophie had survived for at least a short period after their disappearance. It was the first tangible evidence in 6 years, a sign that the case was not entirely closed, that the Hill had not completely swallowed their story. The revelation sent ripples through the town and the investigative community. Families, some of whom had long resigned themselves to absence, felt the stirrings of hope, a cautious optimism tempered by the awareness of the Hill's unpredictability. Investigators, too, were both energized and wary. The evidence did not provide answers to the fundamental questions: who had taken the girls, where they had been held, and whether the man observed by the hiker had been a guardian, a perpetrator, or merely an innocent companion. Every clue suggested life, but also reminded those examining it of the fragility of interpretation. The Hill had once again offered pieces without context, a puzzle without a frame. Psychologists and trauma specialists were consulted immediately to advise families and authorities. They emphasized that after 6 years, the sudden emergence of evidence could intensify emotions, reopening wounds that had partially healed. Hope, while powerful, could also amplify anxiety, obsession, and fear. Families were guided through the process of managing expectations, interpreting findings without succumbing to the volatile swings between optimism and despair. Support networks, both formal and informal, mobilized to provide counseling and community reinforcement, ensuring that the focus remained on measured investigation rather than speculation. Investigators returned to the forest repeatedly, each expedition combining modern methodology with old-fashioned diligence. Drones scanned the canopy while ground teams inspected the forest floor, following footprints, examining soil anomalies, and documenting every artifact of human presence. Each find was meticulously recorded, every remnant of habitation a potential piece in the larger narrative. Over time, a pattern began to emerge. Temporary encampments indicated that the girls had not been confined to a single location, that they had moved through the forest, leaving traces that endured despite years of exposure to the elements. For the first time since the disappearance, the case had direction. While the ultimate resolution remained elusive, investigators now had a tangible framework upon which to build hypotheses. The hiker's memory, once a hesitant recollection, had become a cornerstone in a renewed search for answers. The Hill, long regarded as impenetrable and enigmatic, had yielded proof of human presence, of survival, and of life sustained against the odds. In the town, the collective memory of Emily and Sophie shifted slightly from absence to possibility, from unresolved despair to cautious hope. Yet, the forest retained its secrets. The evidence did not explain the circumstances of their disappearance, the motivations of the man observed by the witness, or the ultimate fate of the girls beyond the temporary traces uncovered. Investigators, families, and the town at large were left to balance hope with the unknown, understanding that while the Hill had offered a glimpse of truth, it had not surrendered its story completely. The unexpected witness had reopened a case long thought dormant, reigniting both investigation and imagination, and ensuring that Emily and Sophie remained central to the consciousness of those who had refused to forget. In that reopening, the narrative of the Hill continued, a place of mystery, danger, and concealed history, yet also of possibility. Evidence of life had emerged after years of silence, leaving a fragile thread of hope that investigators and families would follow, aware that the next discovery could finally illuminate the fate of the missing girls, or reveal further complexities in a landscape that refused to yield simple answers. The case was no longer frozen in the past, it was alive once more, with the weight of memory and the promise of potential resolution hanging over every painstaking step forward. Years after the girls vanished, technological advances in forensic science finally offered a glimmer of clarity. DNA collected from objects recovered near the hidden forest site was run through national databases, producing a match to a man already flagged for unrelated offenses involving minors. Authorities cross-referenced his past movements, discovering a disturbing pattern. He had frequently visited the hill under the guise of hiking or research, familiarizing himself with its hidden trails, isolated clearings, and sinkholes. Each detail suggested deliberate planning, a methodical understanding of the terrain that could allow someone to remain undetected for hours, even days. Investigators pieced together travel logs, receipts, and witness accounts to reconstruct probable routes taken by the suspect. His history revealed intermittent stays in nearby towns, often coinciding with local events or tourist activity, allowing him to blend into crowds without drawing attention. Psychological experts analyzed his known behaviors, identifying manipulative tendencies and patterns of control over vulnerable individuals. Profiles suggested that once he had isolated his victims, he could maintain their concealment without external interference, exploiting terrain and timing to his advantage. The breakthrough shifted the investigation's focus from accidental disappearance to deliberate abduction. Detectives theorized that the girls had been guided or coerced into a series of hidden locations within the forest, where makeshift shelters and traces of temporary habitation confirmed their presence. Footwear impressions, disturbed soil, and remnants of clothing corroborated the theory that the girls had been alive for a period beyond initial assumptions. Investigators reconstructed the timeline, the day of their disappearance, the hours leading to their isolation, and the subsequent movements of the suspect through lesser-known trails and wooded passages. As the evidence accumulated, law enforcement realized the implications were chilling. The sisters had not wandered unknowingly. They had been purposefully isolated by someone who understood how to remain invisible in the wilderness. Public awareness intensified as authorities shared limited details, balancing transparency with the need to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation. Communities along the hill's perimeter grappled with a new fear, haunted by the realization that the familiar trails could conceal malevolent intent. The breakthrough forced a broader reassessment of every previous lead. Anonymous tips, sightings, and false leads were revisited, now viewed through the lens of a calculated perpetrator who exploited both natural hazards and human oversight. The psychological toll on the families in the town intensified, but this grim clarity also provided direction. The sisters' disappearance was not random, not a tragic accident of the hill, but the result of meticulous, premeditated actions. Authorities now had a defined suspect, a probable sequence, and an investigative path toward resolution, turning years of uncertainty into focused pursuit. The knowledge that the girls' fate had been orchestrated by a cunning, methodical individual cast a new shadow over the case, but it also reignited hope. With this breakthrough, every overlooked trail, forgotten footprint, and fragment of evidence could be re-examined, and the relentless search for answers moved from speculation to deliberate, targeted inquiry. The hill that had long symbolized mystery and fear was now central to understanding a calculated crime, a turning point in a story that had remained unresolved for far too long. Years of painstaking investigation culminated in a coordinated operation, bringing together law enforcement from neighboring jurisdictions. Analysts had revisited old maps, aerial surveys, and topographical studies, searching for hidden paths or natural formations that might have been overlooked. Their efforts paid off when geologists and investigators identified a cave system concealed beneath dense undergrowth and a shallow pit camouflaged by fallen leaves and brush. These locations had gone unnoticed during the initial searches, hidden by the hill's uneven terrain and natural cover. Inside the cave and the pit, investigators uncovered belongings that unmistakably belonged to the sisters. Small personal items, clothing fragments, and traces of footprints confirmed that the girls had been present in these locations. The scene revealed signs of confinement, disturbed soil, marks on tree roots, and evidence of makeshift barriers suggested that the sisters had been deliberately kept in these secluded spots. Forensic teams meticulously documented every detail, collecting samples that indicated prolonged occupancy and human handling. The evidence painted a grim picture of calculated exploitation of the environment, a deliberate use of natural hazards to conceal criminal activity. Authorities turned their focus to the suspect, cross-referencing travel logs, GPS data, and known movements over the years. Interrogations were thorough, with investigators confronting him with the recovered items, geographic correlations, and witness testimonies. Under mounting pressure and irrefutable evidence, he confessed. His admission confirmed that he had abducted the sisters and intentionally led them into isolated parts of the hill, utilizing caves and hidden pits to conceal their presence. He detailed how he manipulated the terrain, understanding which areas would remain undisturbed and which paths offered natural concealment, turning the hill itself into a tool for his crime. The confession provided both relief and horror. Relief, because the uncertainty that had haunted families and investigators for years was finally replaced with clarity. Horror, because it confirmed the extent of premeditation, the deliberate manipulation of natural features to isolate and hide vulnerable victims. Authorities used the information to reconstruct the timeline of the abduction and confinement, cross-checking his account against physical evidence and environmental data. Every trail, every overlooked cavity, every subtle soil disturbance aligned with his narrative, validating suspicions that had lingered for years. For the community, the revelations brought a complex mix of emotions. Families experienced closure tinged with grief, knowing exactly how the sisters had been exploited, yet grappling with the calculated cruelty behind it. Investigators reflected on the challenges of terrain-based concealment and the importance of persistence, science, and collaboration in solving cases that had once seemed unsolvable. The hill, long regarded as a place of mystery and fear, had revealed its secrets under scrutiny, exposing a dark story of manipulation, concealment, and exploitation of the natural world. The operation marked a turning point in the case. With the suspect's confession and the recovered evidence, the narrative shifted from speculation to confirmation. The sisters' ordeal, hidden for years within the folds of the hill, was brought into the light. Investigators knew that while the past could never be undone, the truth now provided a foundation for justice, reflection, and understanding, closing a chapter that had loomed over the community for far too long. The hill had finally surrendered its most painful secret. Investigators, equipped with precise coordinates, entered the concealed cave system and the shallow pit one last time. What they found confirmed years of speculation, the remains of Emily and Sophie. Forensic teams worked carefully, documenting every fragment, every trace of evidence that could clarify the girls' final hours. DNA analysis, bone examination, and environmental data reconstructed a timeline that aligned with witness accounts and travel logs. It was a somber, meticulous process, but it provided definitive answers that had eluded authorities and families for years. The confirmation of the timeline and cause of death allowed families a measure of closure, a painful relief after years of uncertainty. Parents and relatives, once trapped in endless what-ifs, could now mourn fully, acknowledging the truth of what had happened rather than the torment of imagining endless possibilities. Counselors and psychologists stepped in to provide long-term support, helping the community process trauma that had seeped into daily life, reshaping relationships and trust. The grief was collective, yet intensely personal, a reminder of how profoundly the disappearance had touched every household in the town. Public reaction was complex. The small town, long haunted by whispered fears and rumors, now faced the reality of a crime that had exploited both innocence and geography. Media coverage, which once inflamed anxiety and spread speculation, now turned toward careful reporting, emphasizing the exhaustive efforts that led to recovery. Townspeople struggled with relief tempered by anger and sorrow, wrestling with questions of how such calculated violence could have occurred in the shadows of familiar landscapes. The hill itself, once a place of adventure and natural beauty, became a symbol of both vulnerability and the hidden dangers that lay in plain sight. Investigators compiled a detailed reconstruction of the case from the initial disappearance to the final discovery. Each stage highlighted the interplay of technology, human observation, and persistence. GIS mapping had revealed previously overlooked paths and caves, Witness courage had provided critical clues that reopened stalled inquiries, and forensic science had translated traces in soil and artifacts into a coherent narrative. Every discovery, every lead pursued, underscored the painstaking nature of solving cold cases and the necessity of collaboration across disciplines and jurisdictions. The final report emphasized lessons learned. Investigators noted how public exposure could complicate recollections, yet acknowledged that community vigilance was often essential in uncovering hidden truths. They highlighted the role of modern techniques in revisiting old evidence, showing that even years after a disappearance, advancements in science and technology could change the trajectory of an investigation. Analysts and detectives reflected on the emotional toll of prolonged cases, the perseverance required to confront despair, and the moral responsibility to provide answers no matter how painful they might be. For the families, closure did not erase grief, but it provided clarity and the beginning of a path toward healing. The sisters' story, once a lingering mystery of fear and speculation, now rested on fact, evidence, and human courage. The community, scarred but enlightened, could remember Emily and Sophie, not only for the tragedy that befell them, but for the resilience of those who refused to let the case remain unresolved. Every step, from disappearance to final recovery, became a testament to persistence, investigative rigor, and the unwillingness to abandon truth, no matter how long it took to surface. In the aftermath, the hill remained, silent and unchanging, yet forever altered in its meaning. It held both the memory of loss and the acknowledgement of justice achieved through determination and painstaking effort. The town had confronted its darkest chapter, reconciled with the past, and emerged with a clearer understanding of vulnerability, vigilance, and the importance of seeing what had once been overlooked. In the quiet that followed, families could begin to grieve fully, communities could reflect, and investigators could close the files, knowing the sisters' story had finally been told in full. Years after the recovery of Emily and Sophie, the hill remained, quiet yet deeply imprinted with memory. Locals who had once avoided its slopes now returned, moving cautiously, some out of respect, others from a need to understand the place that had haunted their town for so long. Paths once considered ordinary now felt charged with history, every ridge and hollow carrying a silent weight. Residents spoke of the hill with reverence, describing small, subtle details that had always gone unnoticed. Shifts in the wind, the way sunlight lingered longer on certain stones, the echoes of distant movements that seemed almost too deliberate to be natural. The place that had inspired fear and speculation had become, paradoxically, a space of reflection and remembrance. Scientists studying the terrain noted an unusual phenomenon. The hill's topography, combined with seasonal changes, caused sunsets to appear elongated, as if the sun itself hesitated before leaving the sky. Light spread differently across the ridges, casting long, lingering shadows that seemed to stretch time. Some described it as a haunting natural echo of the events that had occurred there, a reminder that nature, while indifferent, could frame human tragedy in stark, almost cinematic ways. It was a detail that caught the attention of researchers and residents alike, a subtle testament to the interplay between environment and human experience. The community worked to transform grief into remembrance. Memorials were placed near the hill's entrance and in town squares, photographs and personal mementos honoring Emily and Sophie. Annual gatherings allowed townspeople to share stories, to mourn collectively, and to reinforce the lesson that vigilance and compassion were necessary in a world where human malice could remain hidden behind ordinary appearances. Children grew up hearing their names, learning not just of tragedy, but of resilience, awareness, and the importance of community responsibility. The sisters' story, once a source of fear, became a cautionary tale and a symbol of collective care. For investigators and law enforcement, the hill represented both closure and an enduring reminder of the work required to protect the vulnerable. Detailed reports, cross-referenced with GIS data, forensic evidence, and witness testimony, formed the backbone of a case study on persistent, methodical criminal behavior. Experts emphasized that while natural hazards had shaped the environment, human intent had exploited it. Emily and Sophie had vanished not because of carelessness or accident, but because one individual had manipulated the terrain, using its hidden dangers to conceal malice. It was a chilling conclusion that confirmed the hill's eerie reputation, grounding folklore in reality. The sun continued to set over the hill, prolonged in its descent, bathing the landscape in golden light that seemed almost reluctant to leave. Residents watched quietly, some in solemn tribute, others in reflective contemplation, absorbing the way the hill had changed them and their understanding of risk, tragedy, and justice. Conversations often returned to human responsibility, how vigilance, courage, and persistence had finally revealed the truth. The sisters' names, once spoken with fear or sorrow, now carried respect, remembrance, and the acknowledgement that even in tragedy, closure and justice could emerge through careful, determined effort. The hill stood, transformed from a place of whispered terror into a landmark of communal resilience. It bore the memory of loss, the marks of investigation, and the legacy of Emily and Sophie, whose story had exposed both the darkness and the humanity of those involved. Nature's beauty remained, but layered atop it was the enduring awareness of what had transpired, ensuring that the mystery was never forgotten, and that the lessons learned would continue to inform and protect the community for generations to come. In the prolonged light of those sunsets, the town saw both reflection and resolve, a final acknowledgement that the sisters' disappearance had been the result of deliberate human action, carefully concealed by the natural contours of the hill, and that truth, no matter how long delayed, could still bring understanding, justice, and memory.